The figure of Jesus, central to one of the world's most influential religions, appears to stand firm on sacred ground, but when viewed through the unrelenting lens of historical scrutiny, the soil beneath that figure begins to tremble. The first and perhaps most damning historical fact that fractures the accepted narrative of Jesus of Nazareth is the complete silence of every contemporary historian during the time he supposedly lived. While this absence might seem subtle at first, its implications are earth-shattering. If we accept the traditional timeline, Jesus was born around 4 BCE and died around 30 CE, and yet during that very same era, the Roman Empire boasted an intricate network of scribes, historians, chroniclers, governors, and officials whose very job was to observe, document, and report on events that affected society, culture, or politics. From the bustling forums of Rome to the provincial outskirts of Judea, Roman administrators were notorious for cataloguing revolts, rebellions, uprisings, public disturbances, executions, and charismatic figures who garnered followings. But in this sea of documentation, Jesus is nowhere. Not one Roman record mentions his trial, his crucifixion, his public teachings, or the alleged darkness and earthquake that supposedly covered the land when he died. Figures far less influential than the supposed Son of God are recorded in excruciating detail. Yet the life and death of Jesus, who according to the Gospels moved masses, healed the sick, raised the dead, and turned the very laws of nature upside down, is met with total and deafening silence from the people whose job was to write such things down. Not a single word from the era. It is only decades later, when stories of his life began circulating among small religious sects, that his name begins to surface, long after any eyewitness could be reasonably expected to confirm or deny the accounts. Even Jewish records from the time, known for their deep preservation of history and prophetic figures, omit any mention of a man named Jesus who led a movement or performed divine miracles in the streets of Jerusalem. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher living during the time of Jesus, wrote extensively about religion, philosophy, and Jewish life in the Roman world, and he never once mentioned the man now considered the most famous Jew to have ever lived. If a man had truly walked on water, fed thousands with a handful of loaves, raised the dead, and challenged both Roman and Jewish authorities to the point of public execution, the silence from every contemporary writer is more than suspicious. It is damning. This silence is not an absence of proof in the traditional sense. It is the loudest historical void imaginable, a canyon in time where there should be a chorus of record, but instead there is a vacuum, and the weight of that vacuum crushes the traditional narrative. It forces us to question whether the Jesus of history is a man lost to time or a figure never there to begin with. The implication is not merely academic, it is personal. Because if the world's largest religion began not with an observable life, but with a story told in whispers, grown in gaps, and repeated by those who never saw it firsthand, then what we are dealing with is not simply a theological mystery, but a historical impossibility. The absence of evidence in this case does not suggest we look harder. It suggests we start asking different questions. Who created the story? When? Why? And most of all, if Jesus was never written about by those who lived beside him, what does that say about what we were told he did? The second historical fact that undermines the possibility of Jesus as a verifiable figure lies in the uncanny resemblance between his story and the ancient mythologies that saturated the Mediterranean world long before the New Testament was conceived. The motif of a divine man born of a virgin who performs miracles, gathers disciples, dies a sacrificial death, and resurrects 3 days later is not a unique invention of early Christianity. Rather, it is an echo, sometimes a direct copy, of religious traditions that predate the Gospel accounts by centuries. In ancient Egypt, the god Horus was said to have been born of the virgin Isis, hailed as a savior, and experienced a symbolic resurrection after a battle with evil. In Greece, Dionysus, son of Zeus and a mortal woman, was miraculously conceived, turned water into wine, died violently, and returned from the underworld. In Persia, Mithras was a god who offered salvation, celebrated with ritual meals, and whose birthday fell on December 25th. These are not superficial similarities. They are structural blueprints, narrative frameworks that appear across cultures and religions in astonishing detail, long before the Gospel writers penned a single word. The early Christian world did not exist in a vacuum. It was a rich and chaotic blend of Jewish messianic expectations, Hellenistic philosophy, and Roman imperial theology. Ideas moved quickly. Stories spread through trade routes, captured minds through oral tradition, and morphed with each retelling. In such an environment, it is not only plausible, but historically predictable that new religious movements would borrow heavily from existing motifs to construct something familiar yet distinct. This is exactly what appears to have happened with the Jesus narrative. As Christianity emerged from a small Jewish sect into a Roman world teeming with savior gods, its leaders faced a strategic imperative: to present their Messiah in a language the people already understood. Thus, Jesus became not just a teacher or prophet, but a God-man whose story mirrored the divine dramas already beloved by the public. The virgin birth, the baptism, the temptation in the wilderness, the betrayal, the death, the resurrection. Each of these can be mapped onto earlier mythological structures with alarming precision. This is not to say that the Gospel writers conspired with malicious intent. Far more likely, they were synthesizing oral traditions already infused with mythological archetypes, molded by the expectations of their religious landscape. The results were narratives rich in symbolism, but poor in historical anchoring. And this matters deeply because, if the foundational moments of the Christian story are literary constructions drawn from earlier myths, then the Jesus we are left with is not a figure of flesh and blood, but a character of composite mythology, no more historically verifiable than Osiris or Hercules. The implications are profound, not only for theology but for history itself. When we teach that Jesus was unique, that he did things never seen before, that his story erupted into history like divine lightning, we ignore the centuries of myth that shaped his image. We perpetuate the illusion that the Christian gospel was a radical departure from the past, when in truth it was the past repackaged for a new age. Every time we speak of the Virgin Mother, the sacrificial death, and the glorious resurrection without acknowledging their mythological ancestors, we enshrine fiction as fact. We make the mistake of believing the echoes were prophecies rather than patterns, and in doing so, we place our faith not in a man whose footprints marked the soil of Galilee, but in a myth whose footsteps were traced long before, in the sands of Egypt, the hills of Greece, and the temples of Persia. The Jesus of the Gospels is not impossible because he was miraculous, but because the miracles themselves were pre-written in the legends of gods who never lived. This historical recycling, this narrative repetition is not a crime, but it is a clue that the story we have been told was not created in the streets of Jerusalem, but forged in the furnace of collective imagination, where gods are born to meet the needs of their time. The third historical fact that makes the literal existence of Jesus increasingly untenable centers on the late and contradictory nature of the Gospel writings, which are the primary, indeed the only, substantial sources that attempt to tell his story in any coherent form. And yet these texts are riddled with timelines that do not match, theological agendas that override consistency, and a chronological distance from the events they claim to describe that would disqualify them as eyewitness testimony in any court of historical scrutiny. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written during the lifetime of the man they purport to describe, but decades afterward, with most scholars placing the earliest Gospel, Mark somewhere around 70 CE, roughly 40 years after the supposed crucifixion, and the last John emerging even later, perhaps as late as 100 CE, by which time the stories of Jesus had already been circulating orally, morphing through generations, languages, and interpretive filters, becoming more mythological with each telling. This enormous gap between event and record is more than just a historical inconvenience. It is a gaping wound in the narrative's credibility. No historian would accept as authoritative an account of any political leader, revolutionary, or religious prophet, written by anonymous authors several decades after their death, especially when those accounts contradict each other on basic facts like the date of birth, the genealogy, the details of arrest and trial, the words spoken on the cross, or even the sequence of resurrection appearances. Mark describes a Jesus who suffers silently and dies in anguish. John presents a cosmic Jesus who walks to the cross with divine authority and delivers a final, triumphant proclamation. Luke and Matthew offer divergent genealogies for Jesus, both claiming descent from King David, yet tracing completely different paths, with inconsistent names and generational counts, a discrepancy that defies reconciliation without resorting to strained theological gymnastics. Even the nativity stories diverge sharply. Matthew places Jesus' birth during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BCE, while Luke situates the birth during the census of Quirinius, which occurred around 6 CE, a full decade later, an irreconcilable chronological error that cannot be dismissed as trivial. Furthermore, the resurrection accounts, the very cornerstone of Christian belief, are told with incompatible details across the 4 Gospels. Different women visit the tomb, different numbers of angels appear. Jesus is seen in different places by different people at different times, and in some accounts he instructs silence, while in others he commands proclamation. These are not minor discrepancies. They are structural contradictions that undermine the claim of historical reliability. The Gospel authors were not journalists or historians. They were theological writers with specific doctrinal agendas, writing to particular communities, shaped by evolving theological debates and political circumstances. Their goal was not to record history, but to inspire belief, to assert authority, and to construct a divine narrative that fit the expectations of a growing religious movement seeking legitimacy under Roman rule. The Gospel of John, for example, is so distinct in language, tone, and content that it is considered by scholars not just a different perspective but a fundamentally different theological document, with its Logos theology, anti-Jewish polemic, and heavily spiritualized Jesus bearing little resemblance to the more human figure of the Synoptics. This theological evolution across the Gospels is a red flag to any historian. When a character becomes more divine with each retelling, when miracles multiply, when speeches become longer and more dramatic, we are not witnessing memory but mythology, and perhaps most tellingly, the authors of the Gospels remain anonymous. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were assigned by tradition, not signed by the writers themselves, who never identify themselves as eyewitnesses and provide no sourcing for their information. In any other context, we would call these anonymous, contradictory, post-event writings religious propaganda or folklore, not history. Yet the figure of Jesus, and the enormous structure of belief built upon him, rests entirely on these late and conflicted texts. If the only stories we have about a man were written by unknown authors decades after his death, and those stories do not agree on what he said, what he did, or even when he lived, then we must ask ourselves what we are really looking at: the record of a man who lived, or the invention of a man who was needed. In the absence of clarity, in the presence of contradiction, and amid the silence of contemporary history, the conclusion is not blasphemous but logical. The Gospels tell us what people came to believe, not what truly happened. The fourth historical fact that shatters the presumed reality of Jesus is the complete lack of archaeological evidence tied to his life and ministry, a void that becomes more glaring when contrasted with the detailed archaeological records we possess for other figures and events of the same period and place. First-century Palestine was a crossroads of cultures, a territory under constant surveillance by Roman authorities, a land where synagogues, roads, homes, tombs, and cities were continuously built, destroyed, and rebuilt, leaving behind layer upon layer of physical evidence that archaeologists have unearthed with extraordinary care. From coins bearing the faces of emperors to the ruins of ancient cities, from ossuaries containing the names of high priests to inscriptions confirming the existence of minor political figures, archaeology has time and again corroborated the presence and movements of real historical individuals who walked the same earth during the same decades when Jesus was supposedly performing miracles, speaking to crowds and drawing the ire of religious and imperial powers. Yet despite the intense religious and scholarly interest in proving the gospel narratives, not a single artifact, inscription, or site has ever been conclusively linked to Jesus himself. There is no known dwelling he inhabited, no writings in his hand, No possessions or tools associated with his carpentry, no court documents from his trial, no burial site that can be confirmed with any degree of certainty, and no contemporary structures whose association with Jesus can be substantiated by evidence rather than tradition or legend. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, long claimed to house the tomb of Christ, rests on 4th century assertions, not archaeological fact, and sites like Bethlehem and Nazareth have histories that suggest they were either uninhabited or vastly different in structure during the time of Jesus than what the Gospels imply. Even the synagogue at Capernaum, often pointed to as a place where Jesus preached, has foundations that date later than his lifetime. This is not a matter of simply lacking personal relics, which would be understandable given the time past. It is the complete absence of any physical footprint in a region and era that has yielded an abundance of material history for other, less significant figures. In a land so deeply excavated, where archaeologists have uncovered ancient fishing boats, Galilean homes, crucifixion victims with nails still embedded in bones, and graffiti honoring other messianic claimants, the void surrounding Jesus is inexplicable, if he indeed lived the kind of public life described in the Gospels. Adding to this mystery is the fact that the Romans were known for their detailed records, especially concerning matters of public executions. Crucifixion was a method of state terror and was typically reserved for political threats, insurrectionists or slaves accused of serious crimes. These executions were often recorded, not just in Roman legal logs, but in graffiti, letters, and public proclamations. Yet no Roman document mentions the crucifixion of Jesus, even though the Gospels claim it involved Pontius Pilate, Roman soldiers, a public spectacle, and an inscription declaring him King of the Jews. Moreover, the Gospel stories involve events of great spectacle: a star guiding wise men across nations, mass infanticide under Herod, earthquakes and darkness upon his death, dead rising from tombs, all phenomena that, if real, would almost certainly have left traces in the historical and geological record. And yet again, silence. These are not minor gaps. They are black holes where we should find at least fragments of confirmation. Even accounts of less controversial and less miraculous Jewish prophets have left some form of historical residue. In the absence of any such residue for Jesus, we are faced with a stark possibility. The man described in the Gospels did not leave a physical trace because he was not a physical man in the way history requires. He was a theological construction, retrofitted into real cities, attached to fabricated events, given a setting to make him seem real, but never rooted in the soil of actual archaeology. And if the Jesus we know was placed into the landscape, like an actor on a stage built after the story was written, then what we are dealing with is not the historical biography of a man, but the mythologized origin of a movement. The burden of proof lies not in disproving his existence, but in explaining how someone who allegedly stirred thousands, threatened empires, challenged religious authorities, and upended the natural world could leave no trace. Not a home, not a stone, not a single carved letter spelling his name from his own lifetime. In historical terms, that is not simply unlikely, it is impossible. The fifth and most decisive historical fact that makes the traditional understanding of Jesus impossible is the complete absence of first-hand testimony and the heavy reliance on hearsay, legend, and theological invention that emerged only after the supposed events of his life had passed into memory or myth. In any historical investigation, the gold standard is contemporaneous witness, someone who saw the events, recorded them close to the time they happened, and provided corroborating details that could be verified or challenged by other observers. In the case of Jesus, we have no such witness. Not one letter, diary, speech, inscription, or fragment of text survives that can claim to have been written by anyone who met Jesus, heard him speak, or saw him perform any of the deeds attributed to him. The Apostle Paul, often regarded as the earliest writer in the New Testament and a foundational figure in spreading Christianity, never claims to have met Jesus in the flesh. His epistles, written before the Gospels, offer no earthly biography of Jesus, no mention of his miracles, parables, birth, mother, or specific acts, focusing instead on a divine Christ encountered through revelation, not history. This is crucial Because if even the earliest and most prolific writer about Jesus had no first-hand knowledge of his life and relied solely on visions and theological arguments, then we are not dealing with eyewitness history, but with belief literature. The Gospels themselves, which claim to recount the life of Jesus, were written anonymously and at least a generation or more after the events they describe. They do not identify their sources, and their narratives do not come from named individuals who declare, "I was there." Instead, they rely on layers of oral tradition passed down through communities who already believed in the divinity of Jesus, a factor that inevitably shaped what was remembered, what was invented, and what was emphasized or omitted. Even the names attached to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were assigned decades after the texts were composed and have no historical basis. These were theological attributions, not authorial signatures, moreover. The few non-Christian sources often cited as external confirmation of Jesus, such as Tacitus, Suetonius, or Josephus, either wrote long after Jesus would have lived, show signs of later Christian interpolation, or offer only brief and ambiguous references that cannot be considered independent verification. Tacitus, writing around 116 CE, mentions Christus being executed under Pontius Pilate, but this statement appears decades after Christianity had already spread in Rome and could easily reflect second-hand knowledge or common Christian claims, not a state record. The reference in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews is even more problematic. Its most striking details clearly mirror Christian theology and are widely acknowledged by scholars to be later additions. Not authentic to Josephus' original text, this means that even the so-called confirmations of Jesus outside the Bible are filtered through the lens of Christian tradition, not independent, unbiased historical observation. No Roman census confirms the nativity story. No court records verify the trial. No tomb can be authenticated as his. And most devastatingly, no contemporary person claims to have seen him, heard him, or walked beside him, and then left a written record that can be verified. In the modern world, entire historical events have been reconstructed based on a single, reliable eyewitness account. Here, we have a figure who allegedly changed the world, sparked a new religion, redefined morality, performed the impossible, and yet there is no voice from his time saying, "I was there." Instead, we have decades later writings, constructed by unknown authors with religious intentions, incorporating earlier myths, contradictions, and theological agendas. We have a silence where there should be sound. We have faith in place of memory. And we have belief standing in for biography. The Jesus presented to the world, then, is not a figure rooted in the hard soil of history, but a construct, an amalgam of prophecy, myth, theological yearning, and social need. He is not impossible because he was too divine, but because he was too absent. History leaves behind footprints, and though billions have walked in the path of Jesus, the path itself is without tracks. When all the pieces are placed together, the silence of contemporary historians, the mythological precedents, the late and contradictory Gospels, the lack of archaeological confirmation, and the absence of first-hand accounts, we are left not with the portrait of a man, but with the shadow of a story, one written not by those who knew him, but by those who needed him. The sixth thread, which unravels the historical certainty surrounding Jesus, is the sudden and strategic emergence of his image in tandem with the political needs of the Roman Empire. A phenomenon that suggests not the organic rise of a grassroots prophet, but the deliberate construction of a theological symbol suited to unify and pacify an empire in turmoil. To understand this, we must examine the 4th century, a period of sweeping transformation within Rome, when Emperor Constantine, faced with civil wars, declining civic unity, and the spread of divergent religious cults, found in Christianity not a threat, but a solution. Before Constantine's reign, Christianity was a marginal and fragmented sect, viewed with suspicion by Roman authorities, persecuted sporadically, and racked by internal doctrinal disputes that produced no unified narrative of who Jesus was or what he represented. The Gospels had been written, but they had not been canonized, and the figure of Jesus varied wildly across communities, from the doxetic Christ of some Gnostic texts who never truly suffered, to the apocalyptic preacher of others, to the divine logos of early theologians who debated whether Jesus was fully God, fully man, or something in between. It was in this fractured, chaotic spiritual landscape that Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, calling together bishops not merely for theological debate, but to establish a standard belief system that could stabilize the empire and end the doctrinal chaos. What emerged from that council was not just a creed, it was a new Jesus. The decisions made at Nicaea and solidified in later councils defined Jesus as co-eternal with God the Father, cemented the doctrine of the Trinity, and began the long and politically driven process of assembling what would become the New Testament. In essence, Jesus was transformed from a figure of competing interpretations into a singular imperial symbol, divine, authoritative, and convenient for the consolidation of power. This theological crystallization was not driven by the discovery of new evidence or by a sudden revelation of hidden truths, but by the political necessity of crafting a religion that could unify diverse peoples under one imperial banner. The choice of which gospels to include and which to exclude, the silencing of dissenting voices, and the marginalization of so-called heresies were all part of a broader strategy to define orthodoxy and eliminate the chaos that plagued early Christianity. Gospels like those of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and others were suppressed not because they were less truthful, but because they presented versions of Jesus that did not serve the imperial model. The Jesus who emerged victorious from this political theological process was not the historical Jesus, if such a person had ever lived, but the imperial Christ, an image shaped by bishops and emperors working in tandem. He was stripped of ambiguity, recast in perfection, and draped in the trappings of divine kingship, a figure not of dusty Galilean roads, but of golden mosaics and state-endorsed liturgy. The irony is chilling. The man who supposedly said his kingdom was not of this world became the central figure of a worldly empire's ideological apparatus. In this context, belief in Jesus was no longer just a matter of faith, it became a matter of citizenship, conformity, and power. The fact that Jesus' divinity was not universally accepted until it was enforced by imperial decree should give pause to anyone who assumes the story emerged purely from spiritual conviction. If the Jesus of faith was clarified only through politics, councils, and imperial pressure centuries after he was said to live, then we are not talking about a historical biography, but a manufactured icon. The shift from a contested, barely documented teacher to the enthroned Son of God did not occur in a synagogue, a sermon, or a sacred vision. It occurred in a Roman palace at a table of strategists. The historical impossibility lies not in the mystery of divinity, but in the fact that a figure of such world-changing magnitude left no unified image until power required it. The Jesus that billions revere today is not the result of a continuous oral tradition from eyewitnesses, but the end product of centuries of doctrinal negotiation, suppression, and imperial strategy. The true miracle is not that Jesus rose from the dead, but that from such a void of history, a figure could be raised to the throne of empire and remain there unchallenged for so long. The seventh and perhaps most chilling realization that renders the traditional narrative of Jesus historically impossible lies in the suspiciously perfect alignment between his life story and the psychological needs of the oppressed, the broken, and the politically disempowered in a world dominated by empire, poverty, and religious authoritarianism, suggesting not a biography, but a therapeutic invention, crafted to heal emotional wounds, give cosmic meaning to suffering, and offer hope where none existed, which is not how history records actual lives, but how myths are born to soothe trauma. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Jewish people were reeling under the brutal weight of Roman occupation, their temple destroyed in 70 CE, their political autonomy shattered, their cultural identity under siege. Into this atmosphere of despair, fear, and religious longing came stories of a man who embodied every virtue that suffering people needed, a man who preached meekness, who praised the poor, who promised that the last would be first, who told slaves and peasants that the kingdom of God belonged to them, and who was killed by the empire, but somehow triumphed over it through resurrection. This was not a political manifesto or a philosophical treatise. It was emotional salvation through narrative, a theology of reversal in which weakness became strength, loss became victory, and death became life. This profound psychological inversion, where power was found in powerlessness and humiliation was framed as glory, is not historically verifiable but emotionally irresistible. It mirrored exactly what traumatized communities crave, the assurance that their suffering has cosmic purpose, that their moral worth is superior to that of their oppressors, and that justice will be delivered not through rebellion, but through faith. The Gospel of Luke, for example, contains the Magnificat, a speech attributed to Mary in which the proud are scattered, the mighty are brought low, and the hungry are filled, while the rich are sent away empty, words that offer no historical data, but speak directly to the bruised psyche of the powerless. The figure of Jesus was tailored to fulfill this need. He was constructed not only as a savior, but as a mirror, reflecting back to the broken their worth, their dignity, and their promised vindication. But this psychological precision is itself a red flag. Real historical figures rarely align so neatly with the emotional architecture of a movement. They are complex, contradictory, and often disappoint their followers. Jesus, by contrast, is unnaturally symmetrical. His story fits too well. Every element serves a function. Born poor yet of royal blood, persecuted yet sinless, killed unjustly yet resurrected. He absorbs the archetypes of hero, martyr, prophet, healer, king, and God all at once, satisfying every longing simultaneously. This is not history, it is mythopoeia, the deliberate crafting of myth to meet existential need. The writings of early Christian communities were not dispassionate records of events, but fervent expressions of hope, pain, and longing. Their Jesus was not remembered. He was created in response to their needs. This becomes even clearer when we examine the dramatic theological evolution that occurs within the New Testament itself. The earliest writings, Paul's letters, barely mention Jesus' earthly life and focus entirely on his divine role in a cosmic drama of sin and redemption. Later writings, like the Gospels, begin to humanize him, providing biographical sketches that seem retrofitted to match prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures, many of which are quoted out of context or mistranslated entirely. The idea that Jesus was born of a virgin, for instance, hinges on a Greek mistranslation of the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman, not virgin. His birthplace, Bethlehem, is chosen not for historical accuracy, but to fulfill a prophecy from Micah. His triumphal entry into Jerusalem on a donkey is a staged fulfillment of a passage in Zechariah. Every move, every miracle, every teaching appears constructed to satisfy a narrative arc that predates him. This does not mean the story lacks power, it means it lacks proof. The deeper one looks into the Gospels, the more the figure of Jesus resembles a mosaic made from borrowed myths, political theology, and psychological necessity, not the footprints of a man who actually walked the hills of Galilee. He becomes less a person and more a projection, the embodiment of collective need, the voice of the voiceless, the vindication of the oppressed. And yet, that very perfection is his undoing as a historical figure, because real lives are not perfect. Real prophets leave broken trails, conflicting legacies, and records that scream of their imperfection. The Jesus of the Gospels is too clean, too choreographed, too narratively convenient to be anything other than the product of profound spiritual engineering. And this is the final turn of the blade. He is impossible not because he is too divine, but because he is too perfectly human in all the ways that broken people need him to be. That is not biography. That is myth with surgical precision. It may move hearts, but it cannot rewrite the cold demands of history. The eighth historical fracture that renders the traditional portrait of Jesus impossible lies in the way his story absorbs, mirrors, and reconfigures the messianic expectations of first-century Judaism with such flawless narrative precision that it becomes clear the figure was shaped not by historical memory, but by theological retrofitting, crafted to fulfill prophecies after the fact, rather than embody them in real time, because no historical person could ever align so perfectly with a set of predictions written centuries earlier. especially when those predictions were never intended to refer to a single individual. In the centuries before the rise of Christianity, Jewish communities had endured repeated cycles of conquest, exile, humiliation, and political oppression under Babylon, Persia, Greece, and finally Rome. With each wave of domination, their prophetic literature grew more desperate, more symbolic, and more forward-looking, producing visions of deliverance that were never intended as precise forecasts, but as poetic expressions of collective longing. The so-called messianic prophecies of the Hebrew Scriptures were not crystal-clear predictions of a coming Savior, and historical Jewish interpretation confirms this. They were diverse, scattered, often metaphorical, sometimes contradictory expressions of hope for national restoration, political liberation, or spiritual renewal. Yet when the early Christian movement took shape, its leaders scoured these ancient texts and began weaving them together to create a portrait of Jesus that retroactively fulfilled them all, transforming ambiguous poetic lines into exact biographical checkpoints. The Gospel writers did not simply record what Jesus did. They crafted narratives to make him appear as the long-awaited fulfillment of scriptures that Jewish scholars themselves did not interpret as messianic in the way later Christians insisted. This alone reveals intent rather than memory, construction rather than observation. One of the clearest examples of this retrofitting occurs with the prophecy of Isaiah, which describes a suffering servant who bears the sins of the people. This passage, written centuries before Jesus, was interpreted by Jews as referring either to the nation of Israel as a whole or to a prophet enduring hardship. It was never seen as a prediction of a single messianic figure. The Christian reinterpretation of this poem as a literal prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion is a theological innovation, not a historical recollection. Similarly, the claim that the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem comes from the book of Micah, written in the context of political turmoil, and meant symbolically, not as a literal geographical prediction. Yet Matthew and Luke, writing decades after Jesus' supposed death, engineered conflicting and implausible narratives to situate his birth in Bethlehem, despite other evidence indicating that he was known as Jesus of Nazareth and that Bethlehem may not have even been a thriving town at the time. Luke constructs an elaborate census story to force the family to Bethlehem, a story historians widely reject because no empire-wide census ever required individuals to travel to ancestral towns, and because the dating of such a census contradicts the timeline of Herod's death. Matthew relies on a separate narrative involving a star, foreign magi, and a massacre of infants, a dramatic tale that lacks any historical corroboration and echoes earlier mythic birth stories of divine figures. These discrepancies show not the precision of historical record, but the urgency of theological agenda. The Gospels do not converge on consistent biography, they converge on prophecy fulfillment. Where prophecy demanded a donkey, Jesus rides a donkey. Where prophecy implied betrayal, Jesus is betrayed. Where prophecy hints at 30 pieces of silver, that becomes the amount paid to Judas. Where prophecy imagines a pierced figure, the crucifixion narrative is shaped accordingly. History does not bend itself to fit poems, narratives do. The fact that countless episodes in Jesus' story appear only because a prophecy existed, and not because there is independent evidence that the events occurred, demonstrates that the figure is literary rather than historical. This prophetic reverse engineering becomes even more apparent when examining the messianic expectations of Jews living at the time. Most Jews anticipated a political liberator who would free them from Roman rule, restore national sovereignty, and rebuild the kingdom of David. Jesus, as portrayed in the Gospels, does none of these things. This glaring contradiction required early Christians to reinterpret the very definition of Messiah, transforming it from a political role into a cosmic savior function. The earliest Christians did not discover that Jesus fulfilled messianic expectations. They redefined the expectations to match the story they had embraced. This wholesale reinterpretation is not the hallmark of historical fulfillment, but the crafting of a theological identity. Furthermore, early Christian apologists routinely used mistranslations of Hebrew texts to bolster their claims. The supposed prophecy of a virgin birth, for instance, hinges entirely on the mistranslation of the Hebrew word alma, meaning young woman, into the Greek parthenos, meaning virgin. This mistake, introduced in the Septuagint centuries before Jesus, provided fertile ground for a miraculous origin story that conveniently aligned with the mythic births of gods in surrounding cultures. It was not historical record, but linguistic accident transformed into doctrine. Other prophecies suffer similar distortions. Hosea's reference to Israel being called out of Egypt becomes a retroactive justification for inventing a journey to Egypt in Jesus' infancy. Zechariah's symbolic passage about 30 pieces of silver is transformed into a literal transaction in the betrayal narrative. Despite no historical traces supporting such an event, psalmic poetry metaphorically is reframed as predictions of crucifixion, even though crucifixion did not exist as a Jewish execution method when the Psalms were written. This pattern reveals not history unfolding according to divine script, but storytellers shaping a character to match expectations. The result is a Jesus who moves not through the world of history, but through the logic of prophecy, performing actions not because they were witnessed, but because they were needed to complete a predetermined narrative arc. In this way, he becomes not a man, but a vessel into which centuries of longing, symbolism, and theological imagination were poured. Real lives do not fit prophecies with mathematical precision. Real events do not obey poetic symbolism. Real people do not mirror ancient texts with flawless continuity, but the Jesus of the Gospels does, and that is precisely why he cannot be historical. His life is too synchronous with prophecy, too symmetrical with ancient texts, too perfectly aligned with the theological architecture constructed long before his supposed birth. It is the precision that condemns the narrative, the perfection that exposes the fabrication, the symmetry that reveals the design. He is not impossible because he was said to be divine. He is impossible because he was built to satisfy expectations that existed centuries before him, and no historical person could ever have walked so neatly inside the outline drawn by ancient poets, prophets, and political dreamers. He does not fulfill prophecy. He is made of it. The ninth historical fracture that makes the traditional figure of Jesus impossible emerges from the explosive diversity and internal contradictions of the earliest Christian movements, which reveal not a unified memory of a real man, but a chaotic collision of competing mythologies, theological agendas, and spiritual interpretations that could only occur when no single historical anchor existed to stabilize the narrative, because when a real founder inspires a movement, his followers disagree about details, but they do not disagree about the fundamental nature of the man himself. Yet in early Christianity, every group seemed to follow a different Jesus entirely. In the decades after the supposed crucifixion, the ancient world did not speak with one voice about who Jesus was. It spoke with dozens, each voice insisting on a different identity, a different mission, a different meaning, a different relationship to God. Some groups declared Jesus purely human, a prophet exalted after death. Others insisted he was divine from birth, untouched by human frailty. Some believed he only appeared to have a body, a spirit being who never truly suffered. Others rejected the crucifixion entirely, claiming it was an illusion or a metaphor. Some said the resurrection was physical, others said it was spiritual, and others said it never happened at all. These were not fringe disagreements. They were central disputes among the earliest communities that claimed to follow Christ, disagreements so irreconcilable that the later Orthodox tradition had to suppress, erase, and condemn entire libraries of alternative Christian writings to forge the illusion of unity. The very existence of these competing early Jesuses reveals a profound truth. When a movement begins around a real, historically documented leader, the disagreements that follow rarely involve debates over whether he had a body, whether he died, whether he was born through natural means, or whether he even existed in human form. No one in Buddhism debated whether the Buddha had a physical body. No one in Islam debated whether Muhammad walked the earth. No one in Judaism debated whether Moses was a literal human or an apparition. Only in Christianity do we find such fundamental disagreements at the very beginning, disagreements that make sense only if the figure at the center was not a universally recognized historical individual, but a theological construction open to interpretation. The earliest Christian texts that did not make it into the canon provide chilling evidence of this diversity. The Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus as a wisdom teacher whose message centers on inner enlightenment, with no crucifixion narrative and no resurrection. The Gospel of Peter introduces a surreal cosmic Jesus whose resurrection involves a walking, talking cross emerging from the tomb. The Gospel of the Hebrews depicts a Jesus deeply intertwined with Jewish mysticism. The Gospel of the Egyptians presents a Jesus who condemns procreation and advocates asceticism. The Gospel of Mary portrays Jesus as a revealer of secret knowledge, with Mary Magdalene as his primary interpreter. The Gospel of Judas portrays Jesus as a divine being who laughs at the ignorance of his followers and instructs Judas to betray him as part of a cosmic plan. These portrayals are not variations on a theme. They are different species of theology, different cosmologies wearing the name Jesus as a symbolic garment. This level of divergence cannot arise from a movement centered on a concrete historical individual known to thousands. It can arise only when the central figure is fluid, undefined, constructed through visions, revelations, and interpretive creativity, rather than shared historical memory. Even within the New Testament itself, the contradictions reveal multiple competing Christologies. Paul's letters present a cosmic Christ whose significance lies in spiritual victory over sin and death, not in earthly teachings. Mark presents a suffering, secretive Jesus. Matthew emphasizes a messianic king fulfilling Jewish law. Luke portrays a universal savior with philosophical poise. John elevates Jesus into a pre-existent divine being through whom the universe was created, a radical departure from the earlier Gospels and a sign of theological evolution rather than historical documentation. These are not the kinds of differences that arise from eyewitnesses. They are the kinds that arise from theologians shaping a symbolic figure according to their community's needs. The diversity becomes even more striking when considering the early Christian sects that modern believers rarely hear about. The Ebionites insisted Jesus was fully human and rejected his divinity. The Marcionites believed Jesus was divine but not Jewish, and that the Hebrew God was a lesser deity. The Docetists claimed Jesus had no real body and only appeared human. The Adoptionists taught that Jesus became divine at his baptism, not at birth. The Gnostics interpreted Jesus as a revealer of secret truth who came to liberate souls from a corrupt material world. These incompatible identities did not emerge centuries later. They emerged immediately, which is impossible if early Christians had a coherent historical memory to rely on. The existence of such wildly divergent interpretations proves that the earliest followers did not gather around a universally recognized man whose teachings and actions were widely known. They gathered around a name, a story, a symbolic figure whose meaning could be molded into whatever shape their theology required. Historical figures produce movements with disagreement, but not with this scale of contradiction. A real man anchors interpretation. A mythical figure invites invention. And invention is exactly what we see in the historical record. Communities shaping Jesus into the image they needed, not communities remembering the man they met. The later triumph of orthodoxy did not preserve the true Jesus. It eliminated competing Jesuses by force, labeling them heresies, burning their writings, silencing their followers, and retroactively projecting unity backward into a time defined by chaos. When a figure's earliest identity is infinitely malleable, that figure cannot be historical in the meaningful sense. He cannot be located in time, memory, or shared experience. He becomes a canvas onto which suffering communities project their anxieties, hopes, cosmologies, and visions. That is not the mark of a man. It is the fingerprint of myth. The 10th and final historical fracture that makes the traditional figure of Jesus impossible lies in the way his story crystallized only after layers of censorship, consolidation, and selective memory shaped by those who held power determined which version of Jesus would survive and which would be erased, revealing not the preservation of history, but the construction of orthodoxy, because the Jesus known today is not the product of organic recollection, but the outcome of centuries of institutional editing, in which councils, emperors, and bishops decided which texts to canonize, which voices to silence, and which doctrines to enforce with penalties severe enough to extinguish alternative memories entirely. When Christianity moved from a persecuted sect to an imperial religion, the stakes of defining Jesus became enormous, for the identity of Jesus determined the identity of the Church, the authority of its leaders, and the unity of the empire. The process that followed was not a gathering of eyewitness testimonies, but a ruthless political and theological campaign to standardize belief, eliminate diversity, and create a single, controllable narrative. The earliest Christian world was a landscape of competing texts, each offering different visions of Jesus. But as bishops sought to consolidate power, they created lists of approved writings and condemned the rest as dangerous. The canon that eventually emerged did not appear fully formed. It evolved through centuries of debate, conflict, and suppression. By the late 2nd century, figures like Irenaeus argued vehemently that there must be 4 Gospels and only 4, not because historical evidence demanded it, but because theological symmetry required it, insisting that the world had 4 corners, the winds had 4 directions, and therefore the gospel must be fourfold. This rationale was symbolic, not historical, yet it shaped the canon that billions now accept without question. Texts that contradicted emerging orthodoxy were labeled heretical and destroyed. The Gospel of Peter, which depicted a fantastical resurrection, was banned. The Gospel of Thomas, which portrayed Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom, was suppressed. The Gospel of Mary, which elevated the role of Mary Magdalene as a spiritual authority, was buried. Dozens of writings that circulated widely among early Christians vanished from history because they offered portraits of Jesus too divergent for a centralized church to tolerate. The Jesus who could have been remembered as a healer, a rebel, a mystic, a scholar, a prophet, or a symbol of inner transformation, was narrowed down to a single doctrinal identity approved by imperial authority. Councils such as Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon defined not only who Jesus was, but who he was forbidden to be. Each creed further enclosed his identity within theological boundaries, enforced by political power. When disagreements persisted, emperors intervened directly. Some bishops were exiled, some were imprisoned, some were executed. The official Jesus was not discovered. He was legislated. The destruction of alternative traditions was not metaphorical. Manuscripts were burned, communities were disbanded, teachings were outlawed. The winners wrote the history, and the losers vanished. The Jesus that emerged from this process became an icon of unity for the empire, a figure stripped of contradiction, mystery, and plurality, molded into a tool capable of legitimizing authority, justifying expansion, and suppressing dissent. This Jesus was filtered through creeds rather than memories, councils rather than witnesses, politics rather than reportage. The fact that the single most influential figure in Western civilization reached his final form, not through testimony but through decree, is the ultimate evidence that he cannot be reconstructed as a historical individual. Every layer that might have preserved his biography was overwritten by theological agendas. Every voice that might have remembered him differently was silenced. Every inconsistency that might have revealed the ambiguity of myth was smoothed away. What remains is a perfected image, but perfection is not proof. Perfection is fabrication. And this is the heart of the impossibility. A historical figure generates a trail of memories that converge through shared experience. A manufactured figure generates a trail of doctrines that converge through enforced belief. The Jesus who survived did not survive because he was the clearest reflection of reality, but because he was the most useful reflection of power. His story fits the needs of empires, not the patterns of history. His evolution mirrors the rise of institutions, not the recollections of witnesses. His identity was sculpted by those who needed a unifying myth, not by those who walked beside him. In the end, the impossibility of Jesus as a historical figure does not diminish the impact of the story. It reveals the story for what it truly is, a monumental work of myth-making, a tapestry woven from longing, politics, prophecy, psychology, and power. It endures not because it preserves a man, but because it preserves meaning. And meaning, once enthroned, does not need a historical body to walk. It needs only belief strong enough to carry it forward. The Jesus of history remains unfindable because he was never the foundation. The Jesus of myth endures because he was always the creation, and that creation, refined through centuries of selection and suppression, stands not as the memory of a life, but as the masterpiece of a civilization that needed him into existence.